Good evening. Hello, everyone. My name is Nicole Policini, and I'm proud to welcome you to Hood College this evening for tonight's lecture. A very big thank you to the Office of the President for sponsoring the events this evening, along with the Humanities Council. As the Sophia M. Libman NEH Professor of Humanities, I coordinate the Center of the Humanities on campus, and I work with Hood's exceptional faculty and staff to arrange lectures, art shows, literary readings, and all sorts of events that, through innovative research and creative expression, invite us all to think more clearly and creatively about our role in the world and about ourselves, too. I'd like you to take a moment to mark your calendars, actually, for an event on the 18th of March. We have our very own Mallory Heward from the History Department giving a lecture entitled Far From Home, Maritime Women and the Origins of Tourism in 19th Century Hawaii. So we'll look forward to that. To begin this evening's presentation, it is my pleasure to introduce Hood College's 11th president, Andrea Chapdelaine. Under her leadership at Hood, our president has guided the college community through 2 inclusive strategic planning processes. She has strengthened and expanded academic programs, increased students' experiential learning opportunities, established extensive regional partnerships, and provided compensation and professional support to faculty and staff, and established a culture of data-driven decision-making as well on campus. And not least, to add to your many credentials, you have helped guide our Forging the Future campaign as well. So our president gives back both here on campus as well as in the Frederick community and other higher education communities around us. She served as chair of the board of directors of the Chamber of Commerce and is a member of the Frederick Rotary, the Good Samaritan Club at Frederick Health, and the Heritage Frederick and Friends of Baker Park. So it's my pleasure to pass the microphone on to President Chapdelaine. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you all so much for coming out. I'm so glad we're not dealing with that wind that we had last night. So it is really my honor and privilege to introduce our speaker and recognize her this evening. It was 110 years ago that the 4 pillars on Alumni Hall were dedicated by the classes, very similar to the pillars that we see here. I wonder where they got that idea to put them on our campus, right? They were dedicated by the classes in 1915, 16, 17, and 1918, the classes that were here when Alumni Hall was opening its doors, to represent each of the Hood's core values: hope, opportunity, obligation, and democracy. 5 years ago, Hood celebrated the college's 125th anniversary, and I had the privilege to establish at that time the President's Medal, which we give to an individual or organization who exemplifies one of those core values. The class of 1916 defined obligation as fulfilling personal and professional responsibilities with integrity and to be a responsible steward and servant to the betterment of others in this world. I cannot think of anybody more fitting in terms of that obligation and that value. So I am honored tonight to award Reverend Dr. Barbara Kershner Daniel the President's Medal of Obligation. Before retiring last summer, you can come stand next to me, Reverend Kershner Daniel served 40 years in the ministry, the last 17, as we all know, at the Evangelical Reformed United Church of Christ here in Frederick. She is known for her inspiring sermons, activism, and selfless service to the Frederick community. She has been a tireless advocate for LBGTQ rights and gun control. She embraces diversity, religious freedom, and often brought members of her congregation to temples or mosques in the name of unity and community. For 20 years, she coordinated the school supply drive with the Religious Coalition, which brought supplies to nearly 2,000 students every year. Reverend Dr. Barbara Kershner Daniel, Frederick thanks you for the innumerable ways you have positively impacted the Frederick community and supported so many. So it is my great honor tonight to award you the President's Medal of Obligation. Thank you. Move over here.
I have permission to take this off while I talk. Those of you who know me know that I need to be able to move around a little bit when I speak. I'm honored to receive this medal, and one of the things I would like you all to know is that I follow in the long line of clergy that served Evangelical Reformed Church who were involved in the community. And so I'm grateful to be able to have served that congregation, and I'm grateful that I was able to live out my call both in the church and in the community. So thank you. It's an honor to be here tonight. I was on a roll preparing for this evening, and I was having a great time looking at the material that Hood archivist Mary Atwell gave me, and I'm sorry she's sick and can't be here this evening. And I had lots of files and records from Evangelical Reformed Church. And then I excitedly told our son Mark what I was working on. And I told him how I was always fascinated that the founders of the Women's College of Frederick, later to be renamed Hood College, were men from the Potomac Synod of the Reformed Church, and that these men believed that women ought to have the equivalent liberal arts education as the men of the church. And so for years, I enjoyed telling the story about these men who advocated for women. And education, as we know, has been the foundation for many a comment about the role of the church in society. But for me, it was always critical to tell people that this was at the heart of who we are as a congregation and as a church. And I always talked about these men as an example of how we need to have allies who work with marginalized groups and being their advocates. Mark, aged 35, gave me one of those looks that only our children can give us. And he said, quote, "Mom, are you sure something nefarious wasn't going on? Are you sure the motivation wasn't just to keep the men away from the women so there would be no mingling?" I thought, well, that's a good question. And a good historian or scholar would have, of course, asked that kind of question instead of looking at the material through my, rose-colored glasses and my dewy, eyes. And so in order to convince Mark and myself, I set out to discover what were the motivations for the founding of the Women's College in Frederick. What was happening in the culture and society in those years? What may be in the historical record to provide insights as to why the church, the Reformed Church, made the decision, raised the funds, and continued to provide financial support for a women's college in Frederick? And can we glean any insights from these ancestors that might shed light and hope on our life and higher education and the church today? We know that Hood College was founded on May 12, 1893, meeting in the parsonage then of Evangelical Reformed Church, now Evangelical Reformed United Church of Christ on Church Street. There were 5 men from the Potomac Synod of the Reformed Church who established an independent college for women. Their goal was to found a college which would prepare women for roles both in the home and, if they chose, in the workplace. Their guiding principle was that a liberal arts education provides the best preparation for a productive life. Just that language, do you hear that language? This is 1893. To prepare women for home and, if they chose, you get that? If they chose, for the workplace. It says something about that early vision of the school. The founders, these 5 men, included the pastor of Evangelical Reformed Church, Dr. Edmund Eschbach, along with 4 other prominent leaders who are active in the church and in community groups in Frederick, Jefferson, Westminster, and Harrisonburg, Virginia. These men were not just active in the church, they were also key leaders in community and civic organizations. Their faith was a reflection that what they believed was more than just a personal piety. What they were doing was their faith embodied that commitment to church and society, and not just in Frederick, but even beyond. In 1993, Nancy Nolf, then the director of Centennial Planning and Programs at Hood, explained, while most colleges have been founded with major gifts from prominent individuals, Hood's founders had virtually no financial resources. Others might have said that there were not adequate finances to initiate the task. But these men eagerly assumed the risk because they had a strong faith that what they were doing was simply the right thing. As an aside, there's a lot of church institutions that begin with limited resources, founded on faith, first believing that this was a vision, and then hoping and praying that resources would come later. The Reformed Church included the college in its annual budget for many years. In response to a plea from those same men and others of the Potomac Synod, the church leaders in 1911 said that there needed to be an endowment fund for the school. And then Margaret Scholl Hood came to the board of directors of the college and offered the full $20,000 that was requested, free from any conditions. And ask Nancy how nice that is. To be used as needed and necessary. That's how strong she felt that there needed to be education of women. Now, more gifts have come in later, thank God, right? Many of the buildings on the Hood campus are named after significant donors who were also members and leaders in the Reformed Church. And you'll recognize these names: Broadback, Schreiner, Koblenz among them, and of course, Hood College being named after Margaret Scholl Hood. And you can read a lot about these people on the website, thanks to Mary. Margaret Scholl Hood wasn't just a donor to the college. She, like those men, exemplified how donors can make a difference in a lot of different settings. So we have a lot of stained glass windows at ERUCC that's just full of her memorials. Stained glass windows in memory of her family members. The lectern and the pulpit were donated in honor of the pastors, Zacharias and Eschbach. And so we know that all of this was, part of that tradition of the Reformed Church. But I want to go back a little bit. We know that this vision from the founders of Hood and the generous gifts of members of the Reformed Church did not occur in a vacuum. And it wasn't as if one day those guys were sitting around drinking coffee and eating cake and said, wouldn't it be cool if we started a women's college here in Frederick? I'm proposing that their vision and energy for founding a school here in Frederick was years in the making and nurtured by events in society as well as conversations in the wider church. I had a great time exploring this question, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to do this. I hope what I found interesting, you'll find interesting too. So that's my hope, that in the time together, as I share some of what I learned, I found answers to my own question. Where did the vision of a college which would prepare women for roles both in the home and, if they chose, the workplace come from? And there's our Margaret Scholl hood. At the core of our heritage as Protestants, any of you that have been through confirmation class in a Protestant church should know these guys, there was the value of an education. The ability for the general public to be able to read and understand the Bible, the scriptures, in their own language was a major emphasis of the Protestant reformers. And here we have a picture of Martin Luther and John Calvin. We know that in 1523, Martin Luther urged the establishment of schools, and in 1536, John Calvin urged that the citizens of Geneva maintain free schools for all children. Both of these Protestant reformers believed that government should be based on a biblical covenant, and the only way people would engage in government and obey government was if they were able to read the Bible and knew that that's where the rules came from. The education contributed in their minds to replacing ignorance with knowledge, immaturity with maturity, and there was a demand for an educated and scholarly clergy that then was joined together with a need to have an educated laity. The value of education came to the New World with the German Reformed Church, who affirmed the importance of these educated clergy and literacy for its members. Because of this language factor, those early German Reformed settlers in Pennsylvania often provided schooling for their members. And they called them charity schools for poor German families because they didn't have the funds to go to any of the private schools that were available in Philadelphia or Reading area. And they were convinced and wanted to express that there was an importance for everyone in their community to read. At the founding of Evangelical Reformed Church in the mid-1700s, the first building constructed was a schoolhouse, which was also used for worship. One of the founders of the church and a founder of the city of Frederick is John Thomas Schley. He was the first schoolmaster. And Schley not only taught school, in the absence of a pastor of clergy, he also led the congregation in worship. And Reverend Michael Schlatter, who was an early organizer of German Reformed churches in the area, visited Frederick in 1748, and he wrote this in his journal. It is a great privilege of this congregation that it has the best schoolmaster whom I have found in America. He omits neither diligence nor labor in teaching the youth and edifying the congregation with all his ability by singing and reading the Word of God and printed sermons on every Lord's Day. That's John Thomas Schley. During the Civil War, women assumed roles in the family and the community usually held by men. And when the war was over, it's not a surprise that many of these women did not wish to return to those previous roles. And as we know, the Civil War upended our nation in many ways. On the heels of the Civil War came the Industrial Revolution. There was a growing number of immigrants who came to the United States, and into that mix was something that people began to call the women question. Women were no longer willing to be solely defined by their roles in the home, and they wanted to be involved in the community, and they demanded the right to vote. In the Reformed Church, the women expanded their roles by forming their own societies that they called mission societies. And this was true for many denominations in the United States. And it started with one female mission society in 1861, and by 1909, there were 44 societies with 4,700 women involved in this work. And their work supported schools, colleges, hospitals. They published all kinds of periodicals that were read by millions of Protestant church members. And women of the Reformed Church were part of this movement. They believed that women could transform the world and society through Christianity. Now we look back in our successor denomination to the Reformed Church, the United Church of Christ, no longer sees saving pagans and heathens as part of our mission. But I don't want us to lose what was happening with those women's societies. They took control and said, this is what we would like to do. And they established all kinds of institutions and societies and groups that took care of the poor, immigrants, children, the elderly, and especially education. Around this area, some of the children's homes, Hoffman Homes for Children in Pennsylvania, Bethany Children's Home, was all part of this movement from these women. And Homewood, that we know here in Frederick, that too came out of this movement from these women's mission societies. One historian has reflected that women missionaries could transform culture because they did have access to the home. If homes could be made Christian, they believed, then all other institutions, even the masculine worlds of business, politics, and government, would follow. Although few of these women, this historian said, would call themselves feminists, they and their supporters believed that by living out their faith, it was synonymous with social uplift. And in the late 19th century, this connection between home and society provided a very powerful argument for why women needed to be in the home and outside the home. I hope you're following this. I'm just planting the seeds here. This I found fascinating when I learned this years ago. In 1886, the Reformed Church sent 2 women from Pennsylvania to serve as missionaries in Japan, Elizabeth Poorbaugh and Mary Alt. They were active in the church. They were graduates of Kutztown Normal School, known as a training school for educators, is now Kutztown University. And they were single women, and they were sent to work at the mission in Sendai, Japan. And at that time, the Sendai mission was only 7 years old, and there were 3 male missionaries and 2 wives there. And they had already established a boys' school and a seminary for male Japanese leaders. And that school remains today as Tohoku Gakuin University, a liberal arts and engineering school which keeps its ties with the Reformed Church through Franklin and Marshall College and Lancaster Seminary. The mission board asked Poorbaugh and Alt to consider founding a girls' school in Sendai, and they did. And this school remains operating to this day as Miyake Gakuin Junior and Senior High School. Now, I have loved this story because they got to go to Japan at a time when women were still being asked to stay at home. But the mission field provided opportunities for women that they didn't always have here in our own country. And that's a whole nother fascinating part of women's history in the church that could be a whole nother, time together. But I've been fascinated by these stories of these women that went off to Japan and China and Turkey without a man, okay? Without a man. They went with their education and with a vision and with faith. Now, just as a footnote, our own Dr. Eschbach, the pastor of Evangelical Reformed Church, served on the mission board of the Reformed Church when Paul Baugh and Alt were commissioned as missionaries. In 1846, you see there's a lot of stuff that's coming that I think leads up to why this was a poignant time for a women's college in Frederick. But in 1846, members of the Congregational Church, which is a predecessor denomination to the United Church of Christ, established the American Missionary Association, and their goal was the abolishment of slavery and education for African Americans. They too saw education as a way for gaining racial equality. And before and during and after the Civil War, the American Missionary Association founded anti-slavery churches and black schools all throughout the South. They launched more than 500 schools and colleges in the South because they believed that education should be a top priority. These colleges exist to this day as well. Tougaloo, Fisk, Dillard, Talladega, Tulane, and Howard. You see, there was a lot of activity around the value of education, not only in the Reformed Church, but in other denominations as well. So now, to the women. We know that schools for girls existed in the United States in the 1800s, not with a focus on equality of education for girls, but with a primary focus on being good homemakers. Schools were founded like Oberlin College that admitted both women and African Americans. And by 1841 at that school, the women and the African Americans had the same program as men had at other schools. And that's the school that produced some of the early women's movement leaders like Lucy Stone. In the years following the Civil War, there was a call in the Reformed Church to enlarge their male schools. Catawba College, Heidelberg, and Franklin and Marshall College were among them. And into this mix came an energy to include women. In an 1866 article in the Reformed Church Messenger, there was an article that promoted the importance of education for women. They argued, the author wrote in this article that promoters of women's education believed that responsibility of motherhood and being in society required an education. In the same article, the writer tells his readers that the church owes it to its daughters to create schools. 1866. This was the part that I thought was so much fun. This article asked the question, as ministers, how can we conscientiously go to the members of our congregation and ask them to enlarge our male institutions in full view of the pointed question often put by the laity, why does our church continue to spend thousands in enlarging our male institutions, but wholly neglect to pay any attention to the importance of educating our daughters? 1866. And then the writer says, this question has been put by anxious parents, parents who have practical common sense. They are unwilling to bestow thousands upon the education of their sons and then allow their daughters to grow up in ignorance. Author continues, as a church, our laity have the full right to declare in an emphatic way, not one more dollar for our male institutions. We demand an institution now in which to educate our daughters as we wish to see them educated. And to do this now, the laity well know that the church needs funds. It requires an argument to convince hundreds of our best men that we need a female institution of a high order. They know this, and knowing that we need such an institution, they only want the opportunity to contribute toward doing what they want done. More than one father has said to the writer, I will give hundreds toward founding a good female institution, but at present cannot give toward any further endowment of our male college. He was referring to Franklin and Marshall. One brother, a working elder, has given hundreds towards establishing our male institution, made this remark, adding, I have several daughters to educate. I feel as deeply interested in their education as in that of my sons. And the author ends, and why should he not feel as deeply interested? Why should not every parent feel as deeply interested? 1866. 1866. Into that conversation in the Reformed Church comes Robert Emmett Wright, who is a druggist in Allentown, Pennsylvania. He was politically active, and he was very well known for his interests in local schools. And by 1867, several of Wright's daughters were ready to attend school, and there was no place he felt they could get a decent education. And so, at a special meeting of the Reformed Church leadership on July 12, 1867, held at Allentown Zion Reformed Church, you see the ties here, a decision was made to bring an idea forward, and thus was founded the Lehigh Female Academy by the church. The founding of a women's college in Allentown was the direct result of the efforts of the men of the Reformed Church, and it was founded in the basement of the church, and the first classes for Cedar Crest College, which is now called, were held at the church in 1867. I find it really fascinating and heartening that at a time when women were not able to be ordained, supported education for women and sending them to Japan and China and Turkey and all over the world. I find it fascinating that fathers advocated for their daughters to receive an equal education to what their sons were receiving, and they were willing to pay for it. They were willing to provide the funds for that. Into this history, we continue. Evangelical Reformed Church pastors and leaders really wanted to have a major school in Frederick. And at the meeting of the Potomac Synod in Hagerstown in 1820, they decided it was time to found a theological seminary to educate pastors. And Frederick was named as the place for the seminary, and this is why. Because there were liberal men there who were deeply interested in this as well as other movements that looked to the advancement of the church. I find this interesting because I never thought about the Reformed Church being liberal or, advancing in those years, but there it was. But the problem was there was no agreement by the church members as to what language was going to be used to educate the pastors, German or English. And so there was some initial enthusiasm to have the seminary here in Frederick, but the churches in Reading, Pennsylvania had a larger voice, and they feared that language would become the official language of the school because English was so widely spoken in Frederick at that time. And they felt that Frederick was too far away from the center of the Reformed Church in Pennsylvania. Okay, all of this was at play. All of these forces in the society and the church when those founders of the Women's College of Frederick began their conversations. In 1892, the Synod of the Potomac Church, of the Reformed Church, decided to discontinue Mercersburg College in Pennsylvania as a co-ed institution and to make it just an academy for boys, and that it was up to the church to establish a college for women south of the Mason-Dixon line because Cedar Crest was north of the Mason-Dixon line. And if you read the Hood history, the committee looked at 6 possibilities, came down to 2. One was on a tract of donated land in Martinsburg, West Virginia, and the other was to come here to Frederick because the current Frederick Female Seminary on East Church Street agreed to lease the buildings and grounds and equipment to the new school. Like the founders of the Lehigh Female Academy, men from the Reformed Church met in a church building and established this independent college for women. Their vision came from an understanding of their role and responsibilities in the church. In the history of Evangelical Reformed Church, it's written that Dr. Eschbach recognized the obligation of the church to improving political, economic, and social conditions at home and abroad. Dr. Eschbach held the position of president of the Board of Trustees of the college until his death. It was like 17 years he was the president of the board. Dr. Apple, president of Hood College at a Founders Day celebration in 1913, paid tribute to Dr. Eschbach. He talked about his commitment to the school, and of which his 2 daughters were graduates. And Dr. Apple said, as a loyal leader in the Reformed Church and as a firm friend of education, he did not shrink from the responsibility that came to him, but welcomed it as an opportunity to serve both his church and his community, which service he continued for 17 years until the time of his death in 1910. A fun Hood Evangelical Reformed Church story is found in the November 1919 minutes of the consistory. There was a special meeting held after the church service with then Pastor Reverend Kiefer and the elders. And Reverend Kiefer got one of those notes that many of us as pastors get. And this is what the note said, that there were persons who worshiped in the gallery at the morning service who were greatly annoyed by the whispering between the young men and the students of Hood College, and recommended that the active committee take this matter in charge. And so a committee met, and they decided they were going to put leaders of the church in the balcony of the church to prevent the women and the men from having their conversations. See, there was mingling between the men and the women. Just took a little later. So the connection between the college and the Reformed Church continued in the years following. Representatives of the church served as members of the board of directors of the school. I found information that as late as 1959, the General Synod of the United Church of Christ budgeted funds for its 8 colleges. Hood was among them. Students from the college continued to come to the 2 Reformed congregations in Frederick, ERUCC and Grace UCC. The college has had a chaplain and now a dean of the chapel to continue providing spiritual care and support for the students. That ministry has expanded from Christians to all faiths and those who may be questioning their faith. In June of 1914, the article that talks about the laying of the Hood cornerstone speaks about the procession that included all of these elaborate preparations for the cornerstone laying, and it included all of these dignitaries from the school, the president, the staff, faculty, and also all the ministers who were present from the church participated in that cornerstone laying parade. The newspaper was quoted as saying, someone from the college said, "This is a new era for the education of women of the Reformed Church of America and the rest of the nation." And there's more. This, I think, I also found interesting. This was from the Frederick paper. Just as the Rosetta Stone, discovered and placed in the British Museum, was found to be a key to the history and languages of ancient races, just so the laying of this cornerstone of Greater Hood College becomes the key to the education of women of coming generations. That was one of the speakers, Reverend Stein. And I thought, Hood College being compared to the Rosetta Stone, that's pretty cool. How's that for a vision? And there was more to his address. He said that Hood College fulfilled the dreams and desires of the Reformed Church. It was the pride of the church. It was the pride of the church. And it gives the women of the Reformed Church the opportunity to secure an education that our boys have had for many years. To the church, it gives a standard institution of education, and to Frederick, it gives the benefit of his uplifting influence. While the relationship between the church and the college has changed over the years, to me there continues to be ties and similarities between Hood College and Evangelical Reformed Church. Both the college and the church have sought to respond to the changing needs of those we serve. The curriculum obviously has changed at Hood over the years to meet changing needs. The leaders of the college and the faculty continue to be engaged in the community, participating in a variety of groups and organizations and providing support for business and government. There's big dreams and visions that continue to energize the college as it adds programs and builds new buildings and renovates existing space. The pastors of ERUCC, following Dr. Eschbach, continued their support of Hood and education. Some of you may not know, but it was because of that kind of influence that Evangelical Reformed Church founded the first weekday kindergarten in Frederick County in 1961. Many of the members of the church continue to be Hood graduates and bring those Hood values of hope, opportunity, obligation, and democracy to their time given to the church and the community. And it will not surprise you that many members of the church are educators, and we know that they embody Hood's values in the classroom. And while the leaders of Evangelical Reformed Church have not founded another college since Hood, big dreams and visions continue to be fulfilled by the congregation. Under Reverend Wenner's leadership, the Religious Coalition for Emergency Human Needs was founded, and daybreak services for senior adults. During my ministry, the church played a key role in bringing legislation for marriage equality in the state of Maryland, and we were very proud to bring our unique faith perspective to that work. We also were very instrumental in promoting and leading efforts for a permanent family shelter here in Frederick. The congregation, just like Hood, continues to find ways to respond to the needs of the community and advocate for those who may be left behind. Creating safe space for learning and dialogue and difficult conversations is also a value that we share in nurturing a hopeful and democratic community. These values are not something that just sounds good on a website or a college brochure or a church brochure. Creating safe space, we know, is critical for our society today, and current events in our country testify to that. Each day, the Washington Post banner has that reminder that democracy dies in darkness. And the darkness is when I shut down because of fear of conflict or fear of what the other person will do or say, and that prevents me from having authentic dialogue. Creating space creates the opportunity for breaking down walls that keep people separate from each other. ERUCC had a plea from a neighbor on Church Street about people congregating behind Trinity Chapel. Those people were of concern to them, and they requested that the church put padlocks on the gates of the church of Trinity Chapel. The people hanging out behind the chapel were not causing any destruction. They needed a safe place, and the church property helped them to feel comfortable and safe. Why would we want to take our discomfort and lock people out? That doesn't make homelessness go away. They are our neighbors, and our value as a church is to embody and to share hope and opportunity and openness. It's at the core of our faith, and it's our obligation in this time and place of what it means to be the church, just as the banner says in front of ERUCC. Trinity Chapel was used every day for 12-step programs and all kinds of groups. There's a labyrinth behind the chapel that people use to walk and to pray. And who was going to be responsible for going to unlock and lock those gates every day? So we said to the neighbors, no. Did you know there was once a fence around Hood College? Dr. Apple, president of Hood, was very concerned about preserving the dignity and respect of the students. There was a lot of rules for those early students. Some of you may know this. Like, they had a strict policy about who could write a letter to one of the students, who could visit, and they weren't allowed to walk outside the campus. There was a fence, and then one day, it was written in one of the Hood periodicals, the fence came down, and there was great joy. That's what he said. There was great joy when the fence came down. Hood is an open campus, which says a lot to me about the values of opportunity and democracy. And it's also a way of saying to the community, we are part of you. You know, we trust you. And I'm sure there have been more than a few conversations at the trustee and staff level about public safety. But think about what this campus looks like and what it represents to people coming into Frederick. Because I want to contrast the Hood campus with another college campus. When I was a trustee at Catawba College, we were visiting different campuses in preparation for some work to be done on the Catawba campus. And one of the places we visited was another school of higher learning in North Carolina, completely surrounded by a fence, a security fence. To visit the campus, I was greeted at a gate by a guard, and while the guard was friendly, still, it was a gate. And once I got through security, there was this huge fountain and all of this fluff and stuff. And I thought I was at Disney World. It seemed so unreal. And I just thought, God help us, I do not want that kind of campus. If you go to this university's website and read about the fence, you will learn that this was the crown to their beautification vision for their campus. And this is what it says on the website. Gone is the noise and heat from asphalt and passing traffic in the center of, I'm not going to tell you the name of school. In its stead is the peace and quiet of a manicured lawn, stately hardwoods, and brick and concrete sidewalks. I am grateful that Hood has an open and, yes, beautiful campus, and it does not shield the students from the community or the community from dealing with the messy issues of life. I'm grateful that my son, Mark, understands the need to question the motives behind actions. He, like many of us, seeks authentic community and safe spaces for learning and conversation. At the founding of the college, there was no nefarious stuff going on. There was just a vision that the women of the Reformed Church could receive an education so that they could serve in the home and in society. So I thank Hood for being a good neighbor. I thank you for not only being a good neighbor, but also for inspiring and connecting and modeling those 4 pillars of hope, opportunity, obligation, and democracy, and for building and expanding on a vision from a small group of men that believed it was their obligation to serve the church and to serve their daughters as much as their sons. And thank you, Dr. Chapelain, for the honor of the recognition this evening. And thank you for the challenge of having to put something together as well. So thank you very much. Yeah.
You mentioned at the beginning of your lecture that when we were founded 141 years ago, we were responding to the Industrial Revolution and the mushrooming amount of women going into the workforce, particularly in service industries. I would argue that our challenge today is that we are approaching a new vantage point where education beyond grade 12 at some point will become compulsory in some form. We are no longer able to say, excuse me, that compulsory education should stop at the age of 17. The challenge that private institutions like Hood have to take up is that not everybody is going to want to go to Maryland or Penn State or a SUNY school in New York. And the answer is not just to add more spaces to land-grant public institutions. My question to you is, what should the Christian response be to the rapidly approaching point where some form of post-secondary education will have to be compulsory so folks can compete economically and culturally?
Yeah. So the Sunday school movement back in the mid-1800s was an effort for young people to learn how to read the Bible, but that was also became the foundation of the public school system in the United States. So the church, at least most of the denominations, have always believed that education ought to be open and available for everyone. If you, I mean, this is a political issue right now, but you will hear of people being very concerned about the charter schools and school vouchers as a means of undermining public education. So I think it's a valid question because we are, the relationship between the church and some of these institutions that the church founded has kind of gone, you know, it's kind of separated a little bit. And so we don't have that same kind of compulsion that we did back in the early 1900s to say, hey, if Hood's going to exist, we got to, you know, contribute to it. So I think it's a great question about the value of how do we help provide education for all young people who are seeking it, knowing that some of us, like me, needed to go to a small school and wanted to go to a liberal arts school and didn't want to go to one of the big schools. So how do we honor that in many different ways? So I think it's a good question. I think the fact that I was asked to come here tonight and talk about that history says something about the values of Hood, wanting to keep in touch with these institutions that have helped the school over the years.
Hi, thank you for this really interesting talk. This is not very germane to what you were discussing, but is related to somehow. As an European, I'm always been kind of perplexed on how all of the higher education system, whilst originating primarily from the efforts of Protestant denomination, but also there's a few large Jesuit schools, etc., has secularized quite quickly and quite dramatically. Whereas, like, for example, we come in countries like mine where there's a much lower religious diversity, all of the oldest institutions are non-religious. So could you say 2 words about that? Because it's all very interesting, and apologies for my ignorance, but as I say, I'm not American.
No.
So.
But you know, a lot of the institutions, the higher education institutions in Europe were also founded by churches. But it's been a long time. But like the Martin Luther and Calvin, there was a lot in Geneva and Germany and all that. But it's kind of, you know, we got further from that. When the people came here, a lot of people came bringing, of course, their faith and their motivations for living out their faith in new ways in this new world. And that was part of their faith, was to establish institutions for older people, for orphans, for the poor, and schools were at the heart of that. So that really, I mean, as I was trying to say, it was really at the heart of what it meant to be a person of faith, was to make sure that everybody had access to an education. Just like everything else changes, I'm not sure how motivated the religious community is anymore for that, to be honest with you. And I think that's sad. I think we all know that education is at the heart of what makes us a democracy, but also creates, you know, strong and vital citizens for the democracy. But what we're seeing now is churches that started these institutions in openness now are sometimes eclipsed by faith groups that are not open. And that concerns me too. You know, that concerns me too. Because if you look at the history of the churches like the Presbyterians, the United Church of Christ, the Reformed Church, these were liberal arts schools with that emphasis on the liberal arts as an openness of exploration. And so to continue to keep that, that's what worries me about smaller schools like Hood, and the dangerous position we can often be in of losing small liberal arts schools, because these are the schools that teach people how to think, you know, and to problem solve and to find different ways of operating in the community. It's not so prescribed as when you go to a large university and you have to be in your lane, let's say. You come to Hood, you can dabble around in all the departments if you want, which is terrific. So I'm not sure I answer all that, but yeah. That's why I think it's important for us to think about these motivations and where could we live that out yet today.
So I saw an article in the paper last week, I think, about the roots of slavery and part of the history of Hood. And I wondered if you could say a little bit about that, and especially about the relationship between the seminary and Hood when it was founded. Maybe this is the wrong place to ask this
I don't
question.
know much about that, but we know that this was an interesting topic that we don't have much historical writing about for the church. I mean, we know that the balcony at one time had persons of color, you know, up there, mostly servants of people. We know that one of our pastors had a slave girl. We know that. But that was before the founding of Hood. So I don't know about the relationship there. Do you want to answer that, or is that another lecture?
We do know that Margaret Scholl Hood's family owned slaves. So there's no evidence that we have uncovered that she herself owned slaves. But one can make the supposition that some of the money that was donated for the founding of Hood came from her family. And so that is the strongest connection we're aware of. If you go on our website, we provide what data we have. We acknowledge it as part of our history. We feel it's important to own that history. But it's a great question, but it's not something that people were documenting for understandable reasons, so it's difficult to see the full picture there. But as far as we know, there was not direct involvement with the founding of the college from people who were slave owners at the time of the founding.
Not going to yell at me because I talked about your
Not at
college,
all,
are you?
no. Just a quick historical thing. Do you know how long the female missionaries stayed in Japan? And in any of your research, was there anything about what their experiences were like when they were over there?
They stayed up until we had female missionaries in Japan, single women actually, working at the school until the 1980s. And part of that money dried up from, like, the church money dried up. So, and there was also a change in the direction of the mission. So by the time the 1980s came around, those schools became schools for more of the elite in Japan. They were well-known schools. And so the UCC said, no, we're not going to support elite schools. We're going to send our mission personnel to other places. But no, I mean, and there's some great stories about what happened to some of our missionaries who were in Japan, who were sent then to China during the Second World War, and they were in part of those internment camps in China. But what I really like, Phil, is that I just think it's fascinating that the church thought, oh, this is all right. We're going to send these two young women in their 20s across the ocean, you know, and there's nothing in the historical record about anybody being worried about their reputation or anything like that, which is exactly what was happening in our country. So if you look at the list of people who served in the mission field in the United Church of Christ, there was a lot of single women because they had a chance to do stuff they couldn't do here. The other thing is they lived long, like they lived to be in their 80s and 90s. I mean, it was a good life for them. I don't know what they were eating and doing, but I mean, you know, you saw, like, you know, you get some bequest, and this woman was 100 years old and she had served 75 years in Japan. You know, it was just, yeah, it was great. I think that looks.
So I'm going to ask you, based on the history, to do a little visioning. So prophetic work is always so much more noble in the rearview mirror. It's always so much more acceptable to look back, be with the safety of what's been done. And with this work that you've done, what would you hope that we would have as a prophetic vision for the present and the future? Because I'm thinking about our students, and I'm thinking about the world that we're living in at the moment, and how social media makes what's going on in other parts of the world so real and present. And for those of us who are a little bit older, it can be hard for us to kind of empathize with other younger groups. And for any of us who are faculty, staff, administrators, what would you like us to be thinking about the importance? I guess I'm feeding you this question.
Yeah.
The prophetic vision that comes to the present that might be a little bit messy and inconvenient, but comes out of really, as you said, deep roots from the founding of Hood College.
So I thought it was in the interim period before you became dean of the chapel, there was a lot of, like, what are we going to do here? And some of us as local clergy volunteered to come meet with students because the dean at the time, Olivia White, recognized that faith, spiritual questions are huge for students. They may not use the word God, they may not use the word spiritual, but these are identity questions. And she was very concerned about filling that gap. And I applauded her. I mean, it was hard because what student is going to come and talk to me? They need to have a relationship with somebody. So my showing up once, a week wasn't going to do much, And so I was so glad that the college said, no, this is an important aspect of our life because those questions are part of a liberal arts education. So creating a safe space on this campus for what's happening in the world today. Like, how do you take all of the disciplines that you're receiving in class and pull this together, and to be in a safe place where you don't have all the answers, and a student isn't expected to have the answer. The student is able to ask the question and say, I'm not sure about this. I would like to explore that. That's what you can get at a small liberal arts school that you can't get in a larger school necessarily, because you can't do that kind of work with 200 people in a class, because you automatically have an intimacy here in the classroom that ought to be celebrated. So my prophetic vision is, I do think that more partnerships between the smaller liberal arts schools and faith communities will be critical, because these are huge questions, and having students know that there's communities out there for when they graduate that could embrace them and continue the identity and exploration work that they've started here in the school can continue. I'm happy to hang, oh, here's another, okay. Yeah.
So I was thinking about the founding of the college and the intertwining and the deep roots that you've been talking about between the church and the college. And what I will admit that I don't know is at what point those two things separated and how that happened. So I don't know if you got as far as that in the history, but I'm curious if you know that.
Yeah, I was trying to like be on the positive. No, just kidding. No, you know, what's happened with a lot of our colleges and institutions is you get new leadership, and not necessarily the presidents, but you get new board members. And then the value of a board member becomes how much money can you bring, not a relationship. So, and I'm not just talking about Hood, I'm just talking about, you know, our nursing homes, our retirement communities, our colleges, this all happens. Now, I would say up until the early 2000s, the conference minister for the Central Atlantic Conference of the United Church of Christ still held a seat on the board. But I don't know how that decision was made to take that UCC position away, but my hunch is he wasn't going to bring thousands of dollars to the school, you know. But I will say that even without that, President Volpe and President Chapdelaine have kept a relationship. You know, it's not the same as it was, but also, to be fair, all of our schools related to the Reformed Church that were funded by the General Synod don't get anything now. So everybody had to, come the 1960s, after we became the United Church of Christ, everybody had to scramble. Like my school, Catawba College, there was no endowment because they were funded by the church. And then all of a sudden, boom, you got to come up with an endowment fund. So, yeah, so the tie has been there. Well, you can't help it. This sign is downtown. You see it all the time, yeah. And if you go on the Hood website, which I'm sure you have, the church affiliation is mentioned prominently in the history. And I appreciate that, you know, so that's why I say the relationship has changed, but it's not severed, you know, it's just different. It's just different. And we're looking for, you know, always looking for ways to strengthen that. Well, I'll hang around for a little bit, but thank you so much for listening to my leanings tonight. It was great to be here.